The Wyoming Territory in 1873 was a place where hope and death walked hand in hand along the dusty wagon trails. Families crossed these endless plains with dreams tucked safely in their hearts, never knowing that some journeys end not in promised lands, but in unmarked graves beneath the endless sky. What happened to the Patterson family on that blood-soaked September morning should have been the end of everything. Instead, it became the beginning of a story so extraordinary that even the Cheyenne elders, who had seen empires rise and fall, would speak of it in hushed reverence around their winter fires. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of September 15th, 1873, dawned with the kind of crystalline clarity that made the Wyoming Territory feel like God's own cathedral. Sarah and Emma Patterson, identical twins of 17 years, sat side by side on their family's wagon seat, watching the sun paint the grasslands in shades of gold and amber. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of sage and the distant promise of snow in the mountains, a reminder that winter would soon make travel impossible. Sarah, older by exactly 7 minutes as she never failed to remind her sister, held the reins with practiced ease. Her hands, calloused from months of hard travel, guided their 2 oxen along the well-worn ruts of the Oregon Trail. Beside her, Emma clutched a small leather journal, documenting their journey with the careful attention to detail that had always set her apart from her more adventurous twin. "Pa says we should reach Fort Laramie by sunset," Sarah said, her voice carrying the slight rasp that came from weeks of breathing trail dust. "Ma's got her heart set on buying real coffee beans there, not the chicory we've been choking down since independence." Emma looked up from her writing, her grey eyes, identical to Sarah's, reflecting the morning light. "She's been talking about those coffee beans for 3 days straight. You'd think they were made of gold, the way she goes on about them." The twins shared a laugh, the easy intimacy of 2 people who had never spent more than a few hours apart. In their entire lives, they wore matching blue calico dresses, carefully mended after months of travel, and around their necks hung identical silver lockets, their mother's wedding gift, each containing a tiny pressed flower from their grandmother's garden back in Ohio. Behind them, in the wagon, their family continued the familiar routines of trail life. Margaret Patterson, their mother, worked quietly on a piece of mending while keeping one eye on their youngest 4-year-old Timothy, who was attempting to teach their dog Rufus to fetch a corn cob doll. Their father, William Patterson, rode ahead on his bay mare, scouting the trail and talking quietly with the other men of their small wagon train. The Patterson family was part of a modest group of 7 wagons, 43 souls in total, making the long journey from Ohio to the Oregon Territory. They weren't wealthy. William Patterson had been a mill worker who'd lost his job when the factory closed, but they carried themselves with the dignity of people who had made peace with hard times and harder choices. "You ever wonder what we'll do when we get to Oregon?" Emma asked, her pen pausing over her journal. "I mean, really do, not just help Pa with the farm he keeps talking about." Sarah considered this, as she had many times during their long journey. "I reckon we'll do what we've always done, take care of each other and figure out the rest as we go." She glanced at her sister's journal, noting the careful sketches Emma had made of landmarks along the trail. "You might become one of those lady artists drawing pictures for the newspapers back east." Emma blushed at the suggestion. Her sketches were just a way to remember their journey, nothing more. But Sarah had always seen possibilities where Emma saw only idle pastimes. It was one of the many ways they balanced each other. Sarah the dreamer, Emma the practical one, though others often mistook which twin was which. The wagon train had been blessed with unusually good weather and few difficulties since leaving Independence, Missouri, 4 months earlier. They'd crossed rivers without losing a single wagon, avoided the worst of the summer heat, and encountered no serious Indian troubles. The men spoke cautiously of their good fortune, as if naming it might invite disaster. Their train was led by Captain James Morrison, a weathered man in his 50s who had made the crossing 6 times as a guide. Morrison was known for his careful route selection and his ability to negotiate with the various tribes they encountered. He carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who understood that leadership on the trail meant making life-and-death decisions with incomplete information. "Ladies," Morrison called out as he rode back toward their wagon, his face serious beneath his wide-brimmed hat. "We've got fresh sign up ahead. Indian ponies, maybe a dozen riders, crossed the trail sometime last night." Sarah felt Emma stiffen beside her, but neither twin showed the fear that immediately knotted their stomachs. They'd been warned about Indian attacks since beginning their journey, but the reality had always seemed distant, something that happened to other people on other trails. "What kind of sign, Captain?" William Patterson asked, riding up to join the conversation. Sarah noticed how her father's hand automatically moved to rest on his rifle, a gesture that had become increasingly common as they'd moved deeper into Indian territory. "Unshod ponies, war paint on some of the tracks," Morrison replied carefully. "Could be a hunting party, could be something else. We're going to tighten up the formation, keep the wagons closer together. And I want every man armed and ready." The change in the wagon train was immediate and palpable. Conversations became more subdued. Children were called closer to their parents, and the easy camaraderie that had developed over months of shared hardship was replaced by the tense alertness of people who had suddenly remembered they were far from civilization. Emma closed her journal and tucked it carefully into the leather satchel she always kept beside her. Sarah noticed her sister's hands trembling slightly as she did so, and reached over to squeeze them gently. It was a gesture they'd shared since childhood, a silent communication that said more than words ever could. "Remember what Pa taught us," Sarah whispered. "If something happens, we stay together, no matter what." Emma nodded, her grey eyes meeting her sister's, with an understanding that went deeper than shared blood. They had been born holding hands, according to their mother, and had never faced a crisis apart. They wouldn't start now. The morning progressed with agonizing slowness. Every ridge might hide warriors, every distant dust cloud could signal an approaching war party. The oxen, sensing their driver's tension, became skittish and difficult to manage. Children who had been laughing and playing just hours before now huddled silently in wagon beds, their wide eyes reflecting their parents' fear. It was just past noon when the attack came. The war cries erupted from 3 directions at once, a sound like nothing Sarah and Emma had ever heard. Wild, primal, and terrifyingly close. Painted warriors on fleet ponies appeared as if materializing from the earth itself, their weapons glinting in the afternoon sun. "Circle the wagons!" Captain Morrison shouted, but it was already too late. The attack had been perfectly coordinated, striking when the train was stretched out along a narrow valley with rocky outcroppings on both sides that provided perfect cover for the attackers. Sarah's hands flew to the reins, trying to control their panicked oxen, while Emma grabbed her father's rifle from beneath the wagon seat. Around them, the orderly progression of their wagon train dissolved into chaos. Men shouted orders that couldn't be heard over the thunder of hooves and the crack of gunfire. Women screamed for their children while struggling to load weapons. With hands that shook with terror, William Patterson wheeled his horse around, trying to reach his family's wagon, but a painted warrior on a paint horse cut him off. Sarah watched in horror as her father raised his rifle, fired, and then disappeared beneath the warrior's lance. She screamed his name, but the sound was lost in the din of battle. Their wagon lurched violently as an arrow struck one of their oxen. The wounded animal bellowed in pain and terror, throwing its weight against the traces and sending their wagon careening toward a cluster of boulders. Sarah fought desperately to regain control, but the reins were slick with sweat, and her hands had lost all feeling. "Jump!" Emma shouted, grabbing her sister's arm. "Sarah, we have to jump!" But Sarah was frozen, staring at the scene of carnage unfolding around them. Captain Morrison was down, his body motionless beside his fallen horse. The Henderson family's wagon was on fire, black smoke billowing into the clear sky. Mrs. Garrett was running across the open ground, carrying her baby, while her husband tried to cover their retreat with an empty rifle. Emma made the decision for both of them. She grabbed Sarah around the waist and threw them both from the wagon seat, just as their wagon crashed into the rocks. They hit the ground hard, rolling among the sagebrush and sharp stones, their matching blue dresses tearing on the thorny plants. For a moment, the world went silent. Sarah lay on her back, staring up at the impossibly blue sky, her ears ringing and her body numb with shock. Then Emma's face appeared above her, streaked with dust and blood from a cut on her forehead. "Sarah, are you hurt? Can you move?" Sarah tested her limbs carefully. Everything seemed to work, though her left shoulder ached fiercely. She sat up slowly, taking in the devastation around them. Their overturned wagon lay smashed against the rocks, their belongings scattered across the ground like discarded dreams. Nearby, their mother's body lay crumpled in the dust. Her sewing basket spilled beside her, its contents now stained with blood. The sight of their mother broke something fundamental in both twins. They had seen death before. The trail had claimed its share of victims to disease and accident, but this was different. This was violent and senseless and wrong in a way that their young minds struggled to comprehend. "We have to hide," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible over the continuing sounds of battle. "Now, before they see us," Sarah nodded, though she felt as if she were moving through a dream. Emma grabbed her hand and pulled her toward a jumble of rocks about 50 yards away. They ran crouched low, their torn skirts catching on brush, their breath coming in sharp gasps that tasted of dust and fear. The rocks formed a small cave, barely large enough for both of them to squeeze inside. As they pressed themselves into the cramped space, Sarah realized that Emma still clutched her leather journal, somehow managing to save it even in their desperate flight. From their hiding place, they could see the final moments of the massacre. The attack had lasted less than an hour, but it had been devastatingly thorough. Every wagon was destroyed, every adult dead or dying. The warriors moved methodically through the wreckage, taking what they wanted and setting fire to the rest. Sarah and Emma held each other in the darkness of their rocky shelter, their identical silver lockets pressing against each other's chest, their hearts beating in the same terrified rhythm they had shared in their mother's womb. They watched their world burn and tried to understand how everything they had ever known could be destroyed so completely in such a short time. As the sun began to set, painting the sky the same red as the blood that now stained the Wyoming earth, the war party gathered their spoils and departed as suddenly as they had appeared. The silence they left behind was somehow more terrible than the chaos that had preceded it. In the growing darkness, Sarah and Emma Patterson, now orphans, now alone, now faced with the impossible task of survival in a wilderness that had already shown them its cruelest face, clung to each other and tried to believe that tomorrow would somehow be different from today. They were 17 years old, hundreds of miles from the nearest settlement, with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a love for each other that would have to be stronger than fear, stronger than despair, stronger than the vast indifference of the frontier that had swallowed their family whole. The wolves began to howl as the last light faded from the sky, and the twins realized that their real trial was just beginning. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The temperature dropped with the sun, and Wyoming nights in September could freeze a person's breath even after warm days. Sarah and Emma huddled deeper into their rocky shelter, their torn calico dresses providing little protection against the mountain cold that seemed to seep through their very bones. Emma's journal lay open between them, its pages catching what little starlight filtered through the cave opening. She had been trying to write about what happened, but her hands shook too violently to form coherent words. The pencil stub she'd salvaged from her scattered belongings felt foreign in her fingers, as if her body had forgotten how to perform simple tasks in the wake of such devastating loss. "I can't," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can't write about what we saw. The words won't come." Sarah reached over and gently closed the journal. Throughout their childhood, Emma had documented everything: family celebrations, seasonal changes, even ordinary Tuesday afternoons that seemed worth remembering. Now, faced with the most important day of their lives, she found herself speechless. "Maybe some things aren't meant to be written down right away," Sarah said, though her own voice cracked with exhaustion and grief. "Maybe they need time to settle before we can make sense of them." The twins had discovered during their long hours of hiding that survival required different skills than either had ever imagined. They had learned to communicate through barely perceptible gestures, to control their breathing so their fear wouldn't betray them, to remain motionless even when every instinct screamed at them to run. Now, as darkness deepened around their shelter, they faced new challenges. The howling they had heard earlier wasn't just wind through the rocks, it was wolves, and the sound was getting closer. "Sarah," Emma breathed, her fingers finding her sister's hand in the darkness. "Do you think they can smell us?" Before Sarah could answer, they heard something that made their blood freeze. The soft padding of paws on stone, accompanied by low, rumbling growls that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. Through the narrow opening of their shelter, they could see shapes moving in the starlight, grey forms that flowed like liquid shadows across the rocky landscape, investigating the scent of death that lingered over the massacre site. The wolves had found the wagon train. Sarah and Emma pressed, themselves against the back wall of their shelter, hardly daring to breathe. They could hear the animals outside, snuffling through the wreckage of their former lives, and the sound sent shivers of primal terror through both girls. But as the minutes passed, something unexpected happened. Instead of threatening growls and the sounds of predators claiming territory, they heard something else, whimpering. The lost, confused cries of creatures that seemed as displaced as the twins themselves. "Those aren't hunting sounds," Sarah whispered, her knowledge of animals gained from years of helping her father with livestock finally proving useful. "They sound scared." Emma strained to listen, and gradually she began to distinguish individual voices in the pack. There were adult animals, but also higher-pitched sounds that could only be coming from cubs. This wasn't a war party of wolves. It was a family group that had been displaced by something, driven from their usual territory, into this rocky valley. As if reading each other's thoughts, both twins realized the same thing simultaneously. The wolves weren't here to hunt them. They were here seeking the same thing the twins sought, shelter and safety in a dangerous world. The largest wolf, a grey female with distinctive white markings around her muzzle, appeared at the mouth of their shelter. For a terrifying moment, predator and prey stared at each other across the narrow space. Emma bit her lip to keep from crying out, while Sarah slowly moved her hand to the small knife her father had given her for cutting rope and preparing food. But the wolf didn't attack. Instead, she tilted her head in what seemed almost like recognition, as if acknowledging the twins' right to the shelter. Then she settled down just outside the opening, her body blocking the cold wind that had been cutting through their inadequate clothing. Within minutes, other members of the pack had arranged themselves around the cave entrance. The cubs, 3 of them barely old enough to be away from their den, curled up against their parents' warm bodies. The wolves' presence transformed the cold, hostile night into something that felt impossibly like protection. Emma's analytical mind struggled to process what was happening. Everything she had been taught about wild animals suggested that wolves were dangerous, unpredictable creatures that would view two helpless girls as easy prey. Yet here they were, sharing space and warmth as if recognizing some common bond of displacement and loss. "They lost their home too," Sarah murmured, understanding flooding through her. "Something drove them out, just like we were driven out." As the night deepened, the strange arrangement continued. The wolves kept watch while the twins dozed fitfully, and when Sarah or Emma stirred with nightmares, the gentle breathing of the animals around them provided an oddly comforting soundtrack. Emma found herself studying the pack dynamics in the dim starlight. The white-muzzled female was clearly the leader, but she deferred to a large male with a distinctive scar across his shoulder when it came to positioning the group for maximum protection. The cubs stayed close to what Emma assumed were their parents, but the entire pack seemed invested in their welfare. It reminded her, painfully, of their own wagon train, the way adults had worked together to protect all the children, not just their own. The way Captain Morrison had made decisions for the good of the group, even when those decisions were unpopular. The way her own parents had worried about the Henderson children when they fell sick, nursing them as carefully as they would have. Their own family. The memory brought fresh grief, but also something else, a recognition that survival often depended on unexpected alliances and the willingness to extend protection beyond blood relations. As dawn approached, Emma began to notice other things about their situation. The rocky shelter was more extensive than they had initially realized, extending back into the hillside, far enough to provide genuine protection from weather. More importantly, she could hear the sound of running water somewhere in the darkness behind them. "Sarah," she whispered, "I think there's a spring back there." They explored carefully, feeling their way along the rock walls, and discovered that their shelter was actually the entrance to a small cave system. Not deep enough to get lost in, but extensive enough to provide multiple chambers for different purposes. And yes, there was fresh water, a small spring that bubbled up from deep underground and flowed toward the cave entrance. The discovery changed everything. They weren't just hiding in a temporary shelter. They had found a place where they might actually be able to survive for more than a few days. As the sun rose, the wolves began to stir. The cubs played briefly in the morning light, while the adults stretched and prepared to move on. But before leaving, the white-muzzled female approached the cave entrance one more time. She looked directly at Sarah, then at Emma, and Sarah could have sworn she saw understanding in those amber eyes. Then the wolf did something that neither twin would ever forget. She placed a paw gently on the ground just outside their shelter, as if claiming the space under her protection, before leading her pack away into the morning mist. Emma immediately began sketching in her journal, trying to capture not just what the wolf looked like, but the expression in her eyes. The gentle intelligence that had recognized their need and responded with something that looked remarkably like compassion. "Do you think they'll come back?" Sarah asked, watching the last of the wolves disappear among the rocks. "I think," Emma said carefully, "that we're not as alone as we thought we were." The day brought new challenges and discoveries. Exploring their expanded shelter, they found evidence that other creatures had used these caves, not just wolves, but humans too. Old fire rings, carved markings on the walls, and cached supplies that had been left by previous occupants. Most importantly, they found tools. Primitive but effective implements that had been shaped from stone and bone, along with dried meat, wrapped in leather that was still edible despite its age. Someone had used this place as a refuge before, and they had left resources that could mean the difference between life and death for two inexperienced girls. Emma began cataloguing everything. They found her natural tendency toward organization, helping them assess their situation more clearly. They had shelter, water, some food, basic tools, and the protection of a wolf pack that seemed inclined to return. Sarah focused on more immediate concerns, gathering firewood, figuring out how to cook the dried meat they'd found, and exploring the surrounding area for additional resources. Her practical nature, which had sometimes frustrated their more scholarly father, now proved invaluable for basic survival. As evening approached and they prepared for their second night alone, both twins realized something fundamental had changed in them. The terrified girls, who had hidden in the rocks 24 hours earlier, were gone, replaced by young women who were beginning to understand that survival was not just possible. It was a choice they would have to make every day. When the wolves returned at sunset, settling into their protective formation around the cave entrance, Emma was ready with her journal. This time, her hands were steady as she wrote, "Day 2. We are alive, we are learning, we are not giving up." The words were simple, but they represented something profound. The moment when victims became survivors, when despair transformed into determination, when two sheltered girls from Ohio began the long process of becoming something their old lives had never prepared them to be. Outside their shelter, the Wyoming wilderness stretched endlessly in all directions, vast and unforgiving, and beautiful. But inside their rocky refuge, surrounded by their unlikely guardians, Sarah and Emma Patterson began to believe that tomorrow might bring possibilities instead of just more loss. They had lost everything they had ever known, but they were discovering strengths they had never known they possessed. And sometimes, in the most unlikely circumstances, that discovery was enough to keep hope alive. 2 weeks had passed since the massacre, and the Patterson twins had undergone a transformation that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who had known them in their former life. Their matching blue calico dresses, once carefully maintained symbols of their mother's pride, now hung in tatters. They had fashioned new clothing from salvaged materials and animal hides they'd found in the cave's deeper recesses, rough garments that prioritized function over modesty. Sarah crouched beside the small stream that flowed from their cave, her hands working methodically to clean the fish she had somehow managed to catch with a primitive trap she'd constructed from bent willow branches and sinew. The girl who had once fainted at the sight of her father butchering a chicken for Sunday dinner now gutted fish with steady precision, her movements efficient and sure. Emma sat cross-legged on a flat rock nearby, her journal open as she recorded the edible plants they had identified through careful experimentation and observation. Her academic mind had adapted to wilderness learning with surprising effectiveness, treating survival as a complex puzzle that could be solved through systematic study and documentation. The purple berries on the thorny bushes, the ones that taste like bitter cherries, they're safe in small amounts, Emma said, sketching the plant with careful attention to detail. But too many cause stomach cramps. The wolves avoid them completely, which should have been our first clue. Sarah looked up from her work, a slight smile crossing her sun-darkened features. Remember when you used to complain that Pa made us learn about plants and animals instead of focusing on proper ladies' accomplishments? I thought learning to identify medicinal herbs was a waste of time when I could be reading literature, Emma admitted. Now I wish I'd paid better attention to Grandmother Patterson's lessons about which roots could be eaten and which ones would kill you. The twins had developed an intricate system of survival that played to each of their strengths. Sarah's natural, athletic ability and practical problem-solving skills made her the hunter and gatherer, while Emma's methodical nature and attention to detail made her their record-keeper and strategist. They had learned to read weather patterns, track animal movements, and identify the subtle signs that indicated whether they were alone in their territory. Their relationship with the wolf pack had evolved into something unprecedented. The wolves returned every evening, settling into their protective formation around the cave entrance, but during the day they had begun including the twins in their activities. The cubs, now completely comfortable with the girls' presence, would play elaborate games that seemed designed to teach the humans important survival skills. "Watch this," Sarah said, setting aside her cleaned fish. She whistled softly. A sound she had learned by imitating the pack's communication signals. Within moments, 3 wolf cubs came bounding around the rocks, followed more sedately by 2 adults. The largest cub, whom the twins had named Shadow for his dark grey coat, approached Sarah directly and began what could only be described as a lesson. He demonstrated how to move silently across rocky ground, placing his paws with exaggerated care and looking back at Sarah to ensure she was copying his technique. Emma watched this interaction with fascination, making notes about animal intelligence and communication. The wolves were clearly teaching them, sharing survival knowledge across species barriers in a way that challenged everything she had been taught about the natural world. "They're preparing us for something," Emma observed, her pencil moving rapidly across the journal pages. All of these lessons, hunting, tracking, moving silently, reading weather signs, it's like they know we're going to need these skills for something specific. Sarah practiced the silent walking technique Shadow had demonstrated, her movements becoming more fluid and natural with each attempt. Maybe they know something we don't. Maybe there's danger coming that we haven't recognized yet. As if summoned by her words, the adult wolves suddenly became alert, their ears pricked forward and their bodies tensing with attention. The white-muzzled female, whom the twins had named Luna, rose to her feet and stared toward the eastern approach to their valley. Both girls immediately fell silent and still, a response they had learned during their first terrifying days when any sound might mean discovery and death. They strained their ears, trying to detect whatever had alerted the wolves. At first, there was nothing but the usual sounds of wind through the rocks and the distant cry of a hawk circling high above. Then, barely perceptible, came the sound of hoofbeats, multiple horses moving at a steady pace, still far away, but approaching their hidden valley. Sarah and Emma exchanged glances, their hearts immediately accelerating with fear. Riders could mean rescue, but they could also mean the return of the war party that had destroyed their wagon train. Or they could mean something else entirely. Outlaws, soldiers, or settlers who might not have friendly intentions toward 2 young women living alone in the wilderness. Luna made a soft sound deep in her throat, and the entire pack began moving toward the cave entrance. But instead of their usual protective formation, they arranged themselves in what Sarah recognized as a hunting pattern, spread out, hidden, ready to attack if necessary. "They're protecting us," Emma whispered, her hand instinctively moving to the silver locket at her throat. But from what? The answer came sooner than either twin expected. The hoofbeats grew louder, and voices carried on the wind, men speaking in a language neither girl recognized, harsh syllables that seemed to echo off the rocky walls of their valley. Sarah grabbed Emma's hand and pulled her deeper into the cave, moving with the silent walking technique Shadow had taught her. They retreated to the farthest chamber they had explored, a narrow space where they could hear what happened outside, but remain completely hidden. The riders entered their valley just as the sun was setting, their timing unfortunate from the wolves' perspective. This was the hour when the pack was most active, most territorial, and most inclined to defend their chosen territory. Through the cave's complex acoustics, the twins could hear fragments of conversation, though they couldn't understand. The voices were male, rough with the accent of men who had spent their lives outdoors. There were at least 4 riders, possibly more, and they seemed to be investigating the remains of the wagon train massacre. Emma pressed her journal against her chest, suddenly terrified that these strangers might discover their hiding place and the evidence of their survival. In her mind, she catalogued everything they had left outside the cave. Fish bones, footprints in the muddy ground near the stream, the small fire ring they had constructed for cooking. But the wolves had anticipated this problem. As the riders moved through the valley, investigating the scattered wreckage of the wagons, the pack began what could only be called a coordinated deception. They moved through the area where the twins had been living, their paws obscuring human footprints, their scent masking the smell of cooked food and human habitation. Sarah watched through a crack in the rocks as Luna deliberately walked over, the most obvious signs of their presence, while other pack members created false trails leading away from the cave entrance. It was a level of intelligent cooperation that seemed almost supernatural. The riders spent nearly an hour in the valley, their voices growing more frustrated as they failed to find whatever they were seeking. The twins couldn't understand their words, but their tone became increasingly agitated, and several times they heard what sounded like arguments breaking out among the group. Finally, as full darkness settled over the valley, the riders departed. But their departure felt temporary, as if they might return when they had regrouped or received new information. Luna appeared at the cave entrance shortly after the hoofbeats faded, her amber eyes gleaming in the starlight. She looked directly at the twins' hiding place and made a soft sound that seemed to convey both reassurance and warning. "They'll be back," Sarah said quietly, understanding somehow passing between her and the wolf. "Those men were looking for something specific and they didn't find it." Emma nodded, already making notes about the encounter. "We need to be more careful. Our tracks, our cooking fires, any sign that we're here. It could mean the difference between life and death." That night the twins and the wolves held a council of sorts. Without sharing a common language, they managed to communicate about the threat the riders represented and the precautions that would be necessary for continued survival. The wolves demonstrated new techniques for hiding tracks, for moving without leaving scent trails, for distinguishing between the sounds of friendly and hostile approaches. The cubs, sensing the seriousness of the situation, participated with unusual focus and maturity. Emma filled page after page of her journal with detailed observations about animal communication, survival techniques, and the complex social dynamics of their unlikely alliance. But as she wrote, she couldn't shake the feeling that their time of relative safety was ending. "Sarah," she said, as they prepared to sleep in the deepest part of their cave, surrounded by the warm bodies of their wolf guardians, "I think we're going to have to make a choice soon." "What kind of choice?" Emma looked up from her journal, her grey eyes reflecting the dim light of their carefully banked fire. "Whether to keep hiding and hope we're never found, or whether to risk everything and try to find help ourselves." Sarah considered this, understanding that her sister had identified the central dilemma of their situation. They had learned to survive in the wilderness, but survival was not the same thing as living. Eventually, they would need to rejoin human society, or they would remain forever balanced on the edge between civilization and wildness. "Maybe," Sarah said slowly, "the choice will be made for us." Outside their cave, the Wyoming night stretched, endlessly in all directions, full of dangers they were only beginning to understand. But inside their rocky refuge, two young women who had been shaped by loss and hardship continued to grow stronger, more capable and more determined to control their own destiny. The riders would return, they were certain of that. When they did, Sarah and Emma Patterson would be ready with skills and allies that their former lives could never have prepared them to imagine. October brought the first snow to the Wyoming mountains, and with it came a harsh reality that the Patterson twins had been dreading since their first week in the wilderness. The techniques that had kept them alive during the mild autumn weather would not be sufficient for surviving a full mountain winter. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in a single night, and their breath began forming ice crystals in a cave that had seemed so warm and protective just days before. Emma stood at the cave entrance, watching the snow fall in thick, heavy flakes that transformed their familiar valley into an alien landscape. The rocky outcroppings that had provided easy navigation were now buried under white drifts, and the stream they depended on for water was beginning to form ice along its edges. "We're going to die here," she said quietly, her journal hanging forgotten in her numb fingers. It was the first time either twin had spoken aloud, the fear that had been growing in both their minds as the days grew shorter and the nights grew colder. Sarah looked up from the pile of animal hides she was attempting to fashion into warmer clothing. Her fingers were stiff with cold despite the small fire they maintained constantly now, and her stitching was clumsy compared to the neat seams their mother had taught them to make. "Maybe," Sarah admitted, her honesty characteristic of how their relationship had evolved during their months of survival. "But not today, and probably not tomorrow. We keep solving one problem at a time, and maybe we'll solve enough of them to see spring." It was a philosophy born of necessity rather than optimism. The girls who had once planned their lives in terms of years and decades now measured success in days survived, meals secured, and nights passed without freezing to death. The Wolfpack had undergone changes as dramatic as those affecting the twins. Their summer coats had grown thick and luxurious, and their behavior had shifted to accommodate the harsh realities of winter survival. Luna, the white-muzzled female who had first accepted the twins' presence, now spent her days ranging far from the valley in search of prey that was becoming increasingly scarce. But more significantly, the pack had begun including Sarah and Emma in their winter preparations, in ways that seemed almost supernatural in their intelligence and planning. 3 days after the first heavy snowfall, Shadow approached Sarah with something she had never seen before, a piece of worked leather, clearly crafted by human hands, that the young wolf had retrieved from somewhere in the mountains. The leather was thick, water-resistant, and perfectly sized to serve as a winter cloak for someone of Sarah's build. "Where did you find this?" Sarah asked, though she knew the wolf couldn't answer in words. Shadow's response was to lead both twins away from their cave for the first time since the mysterious riders had visited their valley. The journey took them higher into the mountains, following game trails that were barely visible under the snow. The wolves moved with confident knowledge of the terrain, but the twins struggled to keep pace in the thin air and treacherous footing. Emma's academic preparation had not included mountain climbing, and Sarah's practical skills were challenged by the need to navigate by landmarks that were constantly changing as snow continued to fall. After 2 hours of difficult travel, Shadow led them to what appeared to be nothing more than another rocky outcropping. But Luna demonstrated that appearances could be deceiving by disappearing completely into what looked like solid stone. Following the wolves, the twins discovered another cave system, larger and more complex than their current home, with multiple chambers that showed clear evidence of recent human habitation. This wasn't an ancient shelter like their own cave, but a place where people had lived within the past few months. Emma's journal came out immediately, documenting everything they found with the systematic attention to detail that had become her survival specialty. The cave contained winter clothing sized for men, women, and children, along with preserved foods, tools, and weapons that represented a level of preparation and skill far beyond what the twins had achieved. But most importantly, they found evidence of why the cave had been abandoned. Scattered throughout the living areas were spent cartridge cases, blood stains on the stone floors, and the unmistakable signs of violent struggle. A family lived here, Emma said, her voice hollow as she examined children's clothing that had been abandoned in haste. They were driven out just like we were driven out of our wagon train. Sarah picked up a hand-carved wooden toy, a horse with intricate details that spoke of patient craftsmanship and deep love. Or worse than driven out. The implications were clear. Whatever had happened to the previous occupants of this cave, it had been sudden and violent. The family had fled or been killed, leaving behind everything they needed for winter survival. Luna watched the twins explore the abandoned shelter with what seemed like purposeful intent. When they had catalogued the most essential items, she led them to a particular chamber where animal hides had been prepared and stored for winter clothing construction. Over the following days, the twins made multiple trips to transfer the most crucial supplies to their own cave. It felt wrong, taking things that had belonged to another family, but survival overruled sentimentality. They needed these resources to live through the winter, and the original owners were clearly beyond needing them. Emma documented everything they took, creating an inventory that she promised herself she would someday use to repay whoever might have legitimate claim to these belongings. It was a gesture toward the civilized world they had lost, an attempt to maintain moral standards even when those standards seemed irrelevant to their current circumstances. The winter clothing transformed their capabilities almost immediately. Properly insulated and protected from the weather, they could venture further from their cave, hunt more effectively, and explore areas of their territory that had been inaccessible during the autumn months. But winter also brought new dangers that tested their survival skills in ways they hadn't anticipated. The mysterious riders returned, this time better equipped for winter travel and more systematic in their search of the valley. The twins watched from their concealed positions as 6 men on horseback spent 3 days methodically examining every possible hiding place. The searchers were clearly experienced in tracking and wilderness survival. They found signs that less skilled observers would have missed: the remains of old cooking fires, worn paths between water sources and shelter areas, even subtle changes in local wildlife behavior that indicated human presence. Emma watched them work with grudging admiration for their expertise, making notes about tracking techniques that she and Sarah might need to learn. But she also noticed something that chilled her more than the mountain wind. These men weren't searching randomly. They had specific knowledge about what they were looking for and where it might be found. On their second day in the valley, one of the riders discovered the abandoned wagon train site and spent considerable time examining the scattered remains. He called his companions over and pointed to specific areas, his gestures suggesting he was reconstructing the events of the massacre. Then he did something that made Emma's blood freeze. He held up a piece of torn blue calico fabric, a fragment from one of their original dresses that had been caught on a thorny bush during their escape. The rider examined the fabric carefully, then looked directly toward the rocky area where their cave was hidden. "They know we survived the massacre," Emma whispered to Sarah as they watched from their deepest hiding place. "And they know we're still alive." Sarah nodded grimly. Throughout their months of survival, they had wondered occasionally about the original attack on their wagon train. Had it been a random raid, or had there been some specific purpose behind the violence? Now they were beginning to suspect that the massacre had been more than simple warfare or robbery. The riders departed after their 3-day search, but their behavior suggested frustration rather than abandonment. They had found evidence of the twins' survival, but not the twins themselves. Emma had no doubt they would return with more men and better equipment. That night, as snow continued to fall and the temperature dropped below anything they had yet experienced, the twins held a council with their wolfpack allies. Without shared language, they managed to communicate the urgency of their situation through gestures, drawings in the dirt, and the complex body language they had learned to read. Luna's response was immediate and decisive. she led the entire pack away from the cave, disappearing into the storm with purposeful intent. The twins were left alone for the first time since their second night in the wilderness, huddled together for warmth and wondering if their protectors had finally abandoned them. But Luna returned before dawn, accompanied not just by her pack, but by other wolves, animals the twins had never seen before, including an enormous male with scars across his muzzle and shoulders that spoke of battles survived and dominance established. The new pack leader studied the twins with intelligent, amber eyes, seeming to weigh their worthiness of protection. Then he did something unprecedented. He approached Emma directly and placed one massive paw on her journal, as if acknowledging the importance of her record-keeping to their collective survival. In that moment, Emma understood that their situation had fundamentally changed. They were no longer two lost girls being protected by a single wolf pack. They had been accepted into a larger community of survivors, creatures who understood that the coming winter would test everyone's ability to endure. As the blizzard intensified outside their cave, the twins found themselves surrounded by more than a dozen wolves of various ages and pack affiliations. The cave that had seemed adequate for two girls and a few animal companions was now crowded with bodies that generated enough collective warmth to make survival possible, even in the worst weather. Emma opened her journal and wrote by firelight, November 15th, we are no longer alone. We are no longer just surviving. We have become part of something larger than ourselves, something that will help us endure whatever comes next. Outside, the Wyoming winter howled with the fury of nature unleashed, but inside their rocky sanctuary, an unprecedented alliance of human and animal survivors prepared to face whatever challenges the coming months would bring. The mysterious. Riders might return with reinforcements. The winter might bring temperatures that would kill the unprepared, and the isolation might drive them to despair. But Sarah and Emma Patterson were no longer the helpless girls who had hidden in terror just months before. They had become something new, something their old world had no name for, survivors who had learned to thrive in partnership with the wild, ready to face whatever tests the mountains would set before them. December brought a cold so severe that water froze solid within minutes of being exposed to air, and the breath of every living creature became visible clouds that lingered in the still mountain atmosphere. But it also brought something the Patterson twins had not expected. Visitors of an entirely different nature than the mysterious riders who had been hunting them. Sarah first noticed the tracks on a morning when the snow had stopped falling long enough for her to venture outside their cave system. The prints were distinctive, moccasins instead of boots, moving in patterns that spoke of different hunting techniques and travel methods than any white man would use. Someone was in their valley, someone who moved with the silence and skill of people who belonged to this harsh landscape. Emma studied the tracks with the analytical mind she had applied to every aspect of their survival. 3 different people, she observed, sketching the various footprint patterns in her journal. 2 adults, 1 smaller, maybe a young person or a woman. They've been watching us for days. The realization should have terrified them. After months of hiding from dangerous searchers, the discovery that unknown people had been observing them undetected represented a complete failure of the security measures that had kept them alive. But strangely, neither twin felt the familiar spike of fear that had accompanied previous discoveries. Luna, the white-muzzled wolf, who had become their closest animal companion, showed no signs of alarm or territorial aggression. Instead, she seemed almost expectant, as if she had been waiting for these particular visitors to make themselves known. The answer to this mystery came 2 days later, when the twins were working outside their cave in the brief warmth of midday sun, preparing winter clothing from the hides they had acquired from the abandoned cave. Sarah was using techniques she had learned by watching the wolves process their prey, while Emma documented each step of the leatherworking process with detailed drawings. A voice spoke from the rocks above them, using English words, but with an accent and cadence unlike anything either twin had heard before. "The wolves told us you were here." Both girls froze, their hands instinctively moving to the crude weapons they now carried constantly. But when they looked up, they saw something that challenged every assumption they had developed about friend and enemy during their months of isolation. Standing on the rocky ledge above their cave were 3 Native Americans, 2 men and a woman, dressed in winter clothing that was both practical and beautiful, decorated with intricate beadwork and symbols that clearly held cultural significance. They were armed, but their weapons were not drawn, and their posture suggested caution rather than hostility. The speaker was the younger of the 2 men, perhaps 25 years old, with intelligent dark eyes and the lean build of someone who had spent his life moving through difficult terrain. When he spoke again, his English was careful but clear. "My name is Running Fox. This is my uncle, Bear Tracks, and my sister, Morning Star. We are Cheyenne, and we have been searching for you since the leaves turned." Emma found her voice first, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Searching for us? Why?" Morning Star answered, stepping forward with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable in the mountain environment. She appeared to be close to the twins' age, with dark hair braided with silver ornaments and eyes that seemed to see everything at once. "Because the spirits told us you were alive," she said simply. "And because you carry something that belongs to our people." Both twins' hands moved instinctively to their silver lockets, the matching pieces of jewelry that had been their mother's wedding gift, and their only remaining connection to their former lives. The gesture was not lost on the 3 Cheyenne visitors. "Those Lockets," Beartrack said, speaking for the first time in heavily accented English. He was an older man, with grey streaking his dark hair, and the weathered features of someone who had lived through many harsh winters. "Where did you get them?" Sarah and Emma exchanged glances, communicating in the wordless way they had perfected during their months of survival. How could their mother's wedding gift have any connection to the Cheyenne people? The Lockets were family heirlooms that had been passed down through generations of their father's family in Ohio. "They were our mothers," Emma said carefully. "A wedding gift from her mother-in-law. They've been in our family for generations." Running Fox and Morning Star exchanged looks that seemed to carry complex communication. Then Running Fox reached into a leather pouch at his belt and withdrew something that made both twins gasp in recognition. It was another silver locket, identical to theirs in every detail except for the intricate engravings that decorated its surface. The same size, the same chain length, the same distinctive clasp mechanism that their mother had shown them when they were children. "This belonged to my grandmother," Running Fox said, holding the locket so they could see it clearly. "It was taken from her during a raid on our village 20 years ago, along with 2 others exactly like it. The raiders were white men who claimed they were collecting debts, but they took much more than money that day." The implications of his words settled over the twins like the mountain cold, sudden, penetrating, and impossible to ignore. Their family's treasured heirlooms were connected to violence committed against native people, violence that their own relatives might have participated in or benefited from. Emma's analytical mind immediately began working through the possibilities. "You're saying our grandfather, that he was involved in raiding Cheyenne villages?" "I'm saying," Beartrax replied, with the patient tone of someone explaining something to children, "that the lockets you wear were made by Cheyenne silversmiths for Cheyenne women. They contain symbols that tell stories about our people, our traditions, our connection to the land and the spirits." Morningstar moved closer, her eyes focused on the lockets with an intensity that made both twins uncomfortable. "May I see them?" After a moment's hesitation, both Sarah and Emma lifted the chains over their heads and handed their lockets to Morning Star. She opened them carefully, examining not just the pressed flowers their mother had placed inside, but the intricate metalwork and engraving that the twins had never fully appreciated. "These belong to my great-aunts," Morning Star said quietly. "Twin sisters like you. They were healers and storytellers, keepers of our people's knowledge about plants and animals and the spirits that guide us through difficult times." She looked up at Sarah and Emma with an expression that mixed sadness, recognition, and something that might have been hope. "The spirits told us that the Lockets had found their way to new twin sisters who would need their protection. We came to see if that was true." Running Fox stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making important decisions. "We have been watching you survive in these mountains for months. We have seen how you learned to work with the wolves, how you adapted to winter conditions, how you protected each other when dangerous men came looking for you." "You know about the riders?" Sarah asked, surprised that their hidden struggles had been observed. "We know about many things," Beartrax replied. "We know those men are not just random searchers. We know they have specific reasons for wanting to find you, and we know that staying hidden in these caves will not keep you safe much longer." The conversation that followed challenged everything the twins thought they understood about their situation, their family history, and their own identities. The three Cheyenne visitors shared information that painted a picture of connections and consequences stretching back decades. Their grandfather, William Patterson Sr., had indeed been involved in raids on native villages, but not as a simple criminal. He had been part of organized efforts to force Cheyenne and other tribes off their traditional lands, efforts that were sanctioned and sometimes funded by territorial governments and business interests. The lockets were more than just stolen jewelry. They were symbols of cultural knowledge and spiritual power that had been separated from their proper guardians. The fact that they had ended up with twin sisters who survived a massacre through alliance with wild animals was seen by the Cheyenne as evidence of spiritual guidance. "The men who are hunting you," Running Fox explained, "they are connected to the same people who ordered the raid on your wagon train. Your family was not killed randomly. They were targeted because your father had information that could expose the people behind decades of violence against native tribes." Emma's journal came out immediately, her need to document and understand, overriding her shock at these revelations. "What kind of information?" Morning Star answered, her voice carrying the weight of long-held secrets. "Your father worked for the railroad company, yes? He kept records of payments made to men who organized attacks on native villages to clear land for railroad construction. Someone wanted those records destroyed, and your family killed to ensure their silence." The twins absorbed this information in stunned silence. Their father's work had always seemed mundane, keeping track of supplies, payroll records, routine business correspondence. They had never imagined that his careful record-keeping might have documented criminal activities. "The men who are searching for you believe those records still exist," Beartrax continued. "They think your family might have hidden them somewhere, or that you might know where they are," Sarah found her voice, though it came out hoarse with emotion. "We don't know anything about any records. Our father never talked about his work with us." "That may be true," Running Fox acknowledged. "But those men will not stop searching until they are certain the information cannot be used against them. Hiding in these caves is not a permanent solution." As the afternoon sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the snow-covered valley, the three Cheyenne visitors made an offer that would change everything for the Patterson twins. "Come with us," Morning Star said simply. "Our village is hidden in a place where white men cannot find it. You will be safe there, and you can learn the true meaning of the lockets you carry." Emma looked at Sarah, seeing her own conflicted emotions reflected in her twin's face. They had survived for months by relying only on each other and their unlikely alliance with the wolves. The idea of trusting their safety to strangers, even kind strangers who seemed to understand their situation, felt like betraying everything that had kept them alive, but they also understood that their current existence was not sustainable. Winter was only going to get worse. The mysterious hunters would eventually find them, and two young women could not remain hidden in the mountains forever. "What about our wolves?" Sarah asked, the question that mattered most to both twins. Running. Fox smiled for the first time since the conversation had begun. "The wolves are welcome too. Our people have always understood that some spirits choose to walk on 4 legs instead of 2. Luna and her pack will find acceptance in our village." As if summoned by the sound of her name, Luna appeared at the cave entrance, followed by several members of her extended pack. The wolves studied the 3 Cheyenne visitors with the same careful assessment they had once applied to the twins themselves. Then Luna did something extraordinary. She approached Running Fox directly and placed one paw on his outstretched hand, a gesture of acceptance and trust that the twins had seen her offer to very few creatures. "The wolves have decided," Morningstar observed with satisfaction. "They trust us to keep their human packs safe." Emma closed her journal and looked at her sister. "What do you think?" Sarah gazed around the valley that had been their home for months, the rocky caves that had sheltered them, the stream that had provided water, the familiar landscapes where they had learned to survive. Then she looked at the 3 people who offered them something they had not dared to hope for, a future that extended beyond mere survival. "I think," Sarah said slowly, "that maybe it's time to stop hiding and start living." As the first stars appeared in the clear mountain sky, the Patterson twins made the decision that would determine the rest of their lives. They would leave their cave refuge and trust their future to strangers who claimed connection through stolen lockets and spiritual guidance. Tomorrow, they would begin a journey toward a new kind of survival, one that might finally offer them the possibility of building something lasting from the ruins of their former lives. The journey to the Cheyenne village took 3 days of traveling through terrain that the Patterson twins would never have believed possible. Running Fox led them along paths that seemed to exist only when viewed from precisely the right angle, through canyon passages so narrow that Sarah and Emma had to walk single file while their wolf companions ghosted silently alongside. Morning. Star had provided them with proper winter moccasins that gripped the icy rocks far better than their salvaged boots, and Bear Tracks carried additional supplies that made the difference between a grueling ordeal and a manageable trek. But it was the presence of Luna and her pack that truly transformed the journey from a leap of faith into something that felt like destiny unfolding. The wolves moved through this landscape as if they had traveled these routes before, and Emma began to suspect that the connection between her pack and the Cheyenne people ran deeper than anyone had initially revealed. Her journal filled with observations about animal behavior, navigation techniques, and the subtle signs that indicated they were moving through territory that was protected and monitored by people who understood wilderness survival at a level the twins were only beginning to appreciate. "Your wolves have been to our village before," Morningstar confirmed, when Emma voiced her suspicions on the second evening as they sheltered in a cave that had clearly been prepared for exactly this kind of journey. "Luna's grandmother was pack leader when my grandmother was young. Our peoples have been allies for many generations." Sarah looked up from the fire she was tending, her face reflecting the same amazement that Emma felt. "You mean the wolves and your tribe have been working together for decades?" "Longer than that," Bear Tracks replied, his English becoming more fluid as he grew comfortable with the twins. "The spirits that guide the wolves are the same spirits that guide our people. when the white men came with their wars and their diseases and their hunger for land that belonged to no one, both wolves and Cheyenne had to learn new ways to survive. The implications of this revelation continued to unfold as they traveled deeper into mountains that seemed untouched by the expansion and development that had consumed so much of the American frontier. This was not just wilderness, it was sanctuary, carefully protected and deliberately hidden from the forces that had destroyed the twins' wagon train and driven countless native peoples from their traditional lands. On the morning of the third day, they crested a ridge that revealed something impossible, a valley hidden so completely within the mountain peaks that it seemed to exist in a different world entirely. Fertile meadows spread along a river that ran clear and swift, surrounded by slopes covered with trees that provided both shelter and concealment. Smoke rose from what appeared to be natural rock formations, but as the twins looked more carefully, they could distinguish the carefully camouflaged lodges and structures of a substantial community. "Welcome to the place the white men will never find," Running Fox said with obvious pride. "Our people have lived here for 3 winters now, since the soldiers drove us from our traditional lands. It is not the home our ancestors knew, but it is safe, and it allows us to maintain our ways." Emma immediately began sketching the valley layout in her journal, but she found herself struggling to capture the essential quality that made this place feel so different from any settlement she had ever seen. The Cheyenne village seemed to grow organically from the landscape rather than being imposed upon it, as if the people had discovered how to live in harmony with the natural world rather than in opposition to it. As they descended into the valley, the twins became aware that their arrival had been expected and prepared for. Children emerged from concealed lodges to watch their approach, but instead of the fear or curiosity that might have greeted strangers, the young faces showed recognition and welcome. "They know about us already," Sarah observed quietly. "Our scouts have been reporting on your survival for months," Morningstar replied. "The story of twin sisters who learned to live with wolves has been told around our fires many times. You are not strangers here. You are the fulfillment of prophecy that our elders have been waiting to see." The word prophecy sent a chill through both twins that had nothing to do with the mountain air. They had come to accept that their survival had been aided by extraordinary circumstances and unlikely alliances, but the suggestion that their experiences had been predicted or spiritually guided challenged their understanding of how the world worked. Bear Tracks seemed to sense their discomfort. "Do not worry about prophecies and spirits just yet," he said kindly. "First, let us get you warm and fed and properly introduced to people who will become your new family." The process of integration into the Cheyenne community proved to be unlike anything Sarah and Emma could have imagined. Instead of being treated as refugees or outsiders seeking charity, they were welcomed as people who had already proven their worthiness through survival and their connection to the spirit world through their alliance with the wolves. The village leader, an elderly woman named Grandmother Willow, whose age was impossible to determine but whose authority was absolute, received them in a lodge that served as both council chamber and spiritual center. She examined their lockets with hands that trembled, slightly with age, but eyes that missed nothing. "These belong to my sisters," she said simply, her English accented but clear. Flying Bird and Dancing Rain were their names. They were killed in the raid that took these lockets along with many others of our people. "For 20 years I have wondered what became of the symbols of their medicine power." Emma found herself speaking before she had consciously decided to respond. "We didn't know. Our family, we never knew they were stolen. If we had known." "Grandmother." Willow silenced her with a gentle gesture. "The lockets found their way to people who needed their protection. My sister's spirits guided them to twin girls who would honor their power even without understanding their origin. This was not theft. This was the spirits ensuring that their medicine would continue to serve those who needed it most. What followed was a ceremony that neither twin fully understood, but both felt in ways that transcended language or cultural barriers. The entire village gathered as Grandmother Willow performed rituals that seemed to formally transfer the Lockets from stolen artifacts to legitimate spiritual tools in the twins' possession. Luna and her pack participated in the ceremony as honored guests, their presence apparently as significant to the Cheyenne as the twins' arrival. Emma watched in amazement as the wolves arranged themselves in patterns that seemed to mirror the arrangement of the human participants, as if they understood the spiritual significance of what was taking place. "You are no longer just Sarah and Emma Patterson," Grandmother Willow announced as the ceremony concluded. "You are now Winter Wolf and Moonwalker, sisters of the Cheyenne people, keepers of medicine power, protected by both human and animal spirits." The names felt strange in their mouths when they tried to speak them, but somehow right in ways that surprised both twins. They had been so many different versions of themselves over the past year, daughters, survivors, wolf sisters, refugees, that taking on new identities felt like a natural continuation of their ongoing transformation. The practical aspects of their integration proved equally surprising. Instead of being expected to abandon their hard-won survival skills, they were encouraged to share them with the community. Their months of learning to live in the wilderness had given them knowledge that proved valuable even to people who had been living close to the land for generations. Sarah's techniques for working with animal hides, developed through trial and error in their cave, complemented traditional Cheyenne methods in ways that improved both approaches. Emma's systematic documentation of plant identification and seasonal patterns provided information that helped the village's medicine women expand their understanding of their new mountain environment. But it was their relationship with the wolves that truly established their place in the community. Luna and her pack had not just accompanied the twins to the village, they had effectively joined the community as active participants in its defense and survival. The wolves ranged widely through the surrounding mountains, serving as an early warning system for any approaching threats. They helped with hunting, bringing down game that supplemented the village's food stores. Most importantly, they provided a connection to the spiritual world that the Cheyenne people recognized as both powerful and protective. "Your wolves are not just animals," explained Singing Bird, a medicine woman who had taken particular interest in Emma's analytical approach to understanding the natural world. "And they are spirit guides who have chosen to walk in physical form to help both you and our people survive these difficult times." Emma struggled with this interpretation, her logical mind wanting to understand the wolves' behavior through natural rather than supernatural explanations. But she could not deny that Luna and her pack seemed to possess intelligence and purposefulness that exceeded normal animal behavior. As the weeks passed and winter deepened around the hidden valley, the twins found themselves settling into rhythms of life that felt both completely foreign and surprisingly natural. They learned to speak basic Cheyenne, participated in daily work that kept the community functioning, and began to understand the complex social and spiritual systems that had allowed these people to maintain their culture despite being driven from their traditional lands. But even in this sanctuary, they could not entirely escape the threats that had driven them into hiding. Running Fox brought regular reports from scouts who monitored the movements of the mysterious riders who continued searching for them. The men had expanded their search patterns and recruited additional help, suggesting that whoever was behind the hunt for the twins had significant resources and determination. "They know you survived the winter," Running Fox reported during one of the evening councils where community decisions were made. They have found the caves where you lived, and they have discovered evidence of your alliance with the wolves. They are beginning to understand that you are not just hiding, you are being protected. Grandmother Willow received this news with the calm that came from having lived through many crises. "Then it is time for the next phase of their education," she said cryptically. "Winter Wolf and Moonwalker have learned to survive. Now they must learn to fight back." The statement sent chills through both twins, but also sparked something that might have been excitement. They had spent months hiding, running, surviving through concealment and avoidance. The possibility of taking active steps to protect themselves and their new community appealed to aspects of their personalities that their former sheltered lives had never allowed to develop. "What kind of fighting back?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying curiosity rather than fear. Grandmother Willow smiled, her aged features transforming with an expression that suggested she had been waiting for exactly this question. "The kind that requires courage, intelligence, and the support of spirits both human and animal, the kind that turns hunted prey into hunters themselves." As the fire burned low in the council lodge and the sounds of the protected valley settled into nighttime quiet, Sarah and Emma Patterson, now Winter Wolf and Moonwalker, prepared to discover what they were truly capable of when survival was no longer enough and justice became the goal. Outside their warm sanctuary, their enemies continued searching, but inside the hidden village, two young women who had already defied death began planning how to ensure that the forces that had destroyed their family would never have the chance to destroy anyone else's. Spring arrived in the hidden valley with a violence that matched the transformation taking place within Winter Wolf and Moonwalker. The snow melted in torrents that turned peaceful streams into raging rivers, while avalanches thundered down the mountain slopes with sounds like artillery fire. But the most dramatic changes were happening within the two young women who had once been sheltered daughters from Ohio. Winter Wolf stood at the edge of the village's training ground, her body, coiled with new muscle, developed through months of intensive preparation. The girl who had once fainted at the sight of blood now held a war lance with the easy confidence of someone who had learned to see violence as a tool rather than a tragedy. Her silver locket caught the morning light as she moved through combat. Exercises that would have been unthinkable to Sarah Patterson just a year earlier. Moonwalker knelt nearby, her journal spread before her as she documented not just their daily activities, but detailed intelligence about their enemies that she had gathered through careful questioning of scouts, analysis of their search patterns, and systematic study of their resources and weaknesses. Emma Patterson's love of learning had evolved into something far more dangerous, the methodical mind of someone preparing for war. The transformation had not been easy or comfortable. Grandmother Willow's declaration that it was time to fight back had launched months of training that challenged every assumption the twins held about themselves and their capabilities. They had learned to track silently across terrain that would defeat experienced hunters, to use weapons with lethal efficiency, and most importantly, to think strategically about conflict rather than simply reacting to threats. "Your enemies have made a mistake," announced Swift Arrow, the war leader who had taken primary responsibility for their combat training. He was a man in his 30s whose scars told stories of battles fought and survived, but whose teaching methods had revealed surprising patience and wisdom. "They believe they are hunting frightened children. They have not prepared for what you have become." The twins had indeed become something unprecedented, young women who combined the survival skills learned in the wilderness with traditional Cheyenne warrior training, guided by an intelligence network that included both human scouts and wolf packs ranging across hundreds of square miles of mountain territory. Luna had proven to be more than just a spiritual guide or protective companion. Under the guidance of the Cheyenne, She had become the leader of an organized reconnaissance system that provided information about enemy movements with accuracy that amazed even experienced warriors. The wolves could detect approaching riders days before human scouts, track their movements without being detected, and report back through a communication system that seemed to border on the supernatural. "Today we test whether your preparation is complete," Swift Arrow continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had led men into combat many times. "Running Fox has returned from his latest scouting mission with news that will determine our next actions." Running Fox emerged from Grandmother Willow's lodge with an expression that mixed satisfaction and concern. Over the months since the twins' arrival, he had evolved from their rescuer into something approaching a strategic partner, someone whose understanding of both worlds, Cheyenne and White, made him invaluable for planning operations that crossed cultural boundaries. The men, "Hunting you have made camp at Bear Creek, about 15 miles southeast of here," he reported. "They have been joined by additional riders, 8 men total now, well armed and organized. But more importantly, they have brought someone new with them." Moonwalker looked up from her journal, her analytical mind immediately focusing on this. New information. "What kind of someone?" "A man who claims to know your father's secrets," Running Fox replied. "Someone who says he can identify the location of the documents that your enemies believe still exist." The revelation hit both twins, like physical blows. Throughout their months of hiding and preparation, they had operated on the assumption that the records their father supposedly kept were either destroyed in the massacre or existed only in the imagination of their pursuers. The possibility that someone actually knew about specific documents changed everything. Winter Wolf felt her grip tighten on her lance, the warrior training taking precedence over the fear that would have paralyzed Sarah Patterson. "Who is this man? How does he know about our father's work?" "His name is Marcus Webb," Running Fox continued. "He worked for the same railroad company as your father, kept similar records about payments and operations. According to our scout, who overheard their conversations, he claims your father hid copies of the most damaging documents before your family left for Oregon." Moonwalker's mind raced through the implications. If such documents existed and could be recovered, they would represent more than just evidence of past crimes. They would be weapons that could expose the people responsible for decades of violence against native peoples and potentially prevent future atrocities. "Where does he think these documents are hidden?" she asked. Swift Arrow answered this question, his expression grim. "In your family's belongings from the wagon train. Items that were scattered during the massacre but not completely destroyed. Webb believes your father sewed important papers into the lining of a trunk that your family carried." Both twins immediately understood the significance of this information. They had spent months assuming that their past was completely destroyed, that nothing remained of their former lives except memories and their mother's lockets. The possibility that crucial evidence of their father's work might still exist, hidden in wreckage they had been too traumatized to thoroughly examine, offered both opportunity and terrible danger. Grandmother Willow emerged from her lodge, moving, with the deliberate pace of someone who had been considering weighty matters. Her presence immediately commanded attention from everyone present, and her words carried the authority of both age and spiritual insight. "The spirits have been clear about what must happen next," she announced. "Winter Wolf and Moonwalker must return to the place where their old lives ended, not to hide or mourn, but to reclaim what was taken and use it to ensure justice for all who have suffered." The prospect of returning to the massacre site filled both twins with emotions they had thought they had processed and moved beyond. But their months of warrior training had taught them to evaluate situations strategically rather than emotionally, and the strategic importance of potentially recovering their father's hidden documents was undeniable. "It's a trap," Moonwalker observed, her analytical mind working through the tactical situation. Webb's presence with our enemies, his claims about hidden documents, the timing of this revelation. Everything suggests they want us to return to the massacre site where they can control the terrain and the circumstances of any confrontation. Winter. Wolf nodded, her combat training making her think in terms of battlefield advantage and tactical positioning. But if the documents actually exist, and if they contain the evidence that could expose the people behind years of violence, then the risk might be worth taking. Swift Arrow studied both young women with the approval of someone whose students had learned their lessons well. You are both correct. It is almost certainly a trap, but it is also potentially our best opportunity to shift from defense to offense, from hiding to striking back. What followed was a planning session that combined traditional Cheyenne War Council protocols with intelligence analysis that would have impressed military strategists. The twins had learned to think like warriors, but they had not lost their ability to analyze complex situations and develop comprehensive strategies. Moonwalker spread her journal open to detailed maps she had drawn of the massacre site and surrounding terrain, based on her memories and subsequent scouting reports. If we approach from the north, using the creek bed for concealment, we can reach the wagon remains without being detected by anyone watching from the obvious vantage points. Winterwolf studied the tactical situation with eyes that had been trained to see opportunity where others saw only danger. The wolves can provide advanced reconnaissance and early warning if additional enemies approach. Luna's pack knows that terrain better than any human scout. Running, Fox added his knowledge of the enemy's probable tactics and resources. Webb and his companions will expect you to approach cautiously, probably at night, probably alone or with minimal support. They will not expect a coordinated assault that uses both human and animal allies. The plan that emerged from their council was audacious in its scope and revolutionary in its approach. Instead of simply attempting to recover the hidden documents, they would use the expedition as an opportunity to capture or eliminate the people who had been hunting them, while gathering evidence that could expose the broader conspiracy behind years of violence. The operation would involve not just the twins and their immediate Cheyenne allies, but coordinated actions by wolf packs, human scouts positioned across the region, and resources that could ensure rapid communication and extraction if the situation became untenable. This is no longer about two girls trying to survive, Grandmother Willow observed as the planning session concluded. This is about justice for all the people who have suffered from the greed and violence that destroyed your family and drove our people from our lands. As the sun set behind the mountains that had protected and shaped them for so many months, Winterwolf and Moonwalker prepared for a return journey that would either vindicate their transformation from victims to warriors or end their story. In the same place, it had nearly ended a year earlier, but they were no longer the terrified girls who had hidden in rocky caves while their world burned. They had become something new, something dangerous, something that their enemies had never prepared to face. Survivors who had learned to fight back, armed with skills that bridged two worlds and guided by allies who understood that some battles must be fought regardless of the personal cost. Tomorrow, they would discover whether their months of preparation had been sufficient to transform them from hunted prey into hunters themselves. The massacre site that had once represented the end of everything they knew was about to become the battlefield where they would either reclaim their destiny or lose everything they had built from the ashes of their former lives. Luna howled somewhere. In the darkness beyond the village, a sound that no longer represented danger or loneliness, but the call of spirits preparing for war. The journey back to the massacre site took 2 days of careful movement through terrain that held memories. Like ghosts in every shadow, Winter Wolf and Moonwalker traveled with a war party of 12 Cheyenne warriors, but their most valuable allies remained invisible. Luna's extended pack, now grown to nearly 20 wolves, spread across the landscape in a reconnaissance network that covered every possible approach to their destination. Moonwalker had spent the previous night sketching detailed tactical maps based on intelligence gathered by both human and animal scouts. Marcus Webb and his 8 companions had established their camp exactly where the Cheyenne War Council had predicted, in a defensive position that offered clear fields of fire and multiple escape routes, but also revealed their expectation that any approaching enemies would use conventional tactics. They have positioned themselves to repel a direct assault by a small group of desperate survivors, she observed, pointing to the positions marked in her journal. They expect us to approach like victims seeking justice, not like warriors who have learned to think strategically. Winter Wolf checked her weapons for the final time. A traditional Cheyenne war lance, a bow and arrows crafted by the village's master Fletcher, and a knife that had been forged specifically for her hands by the tribe's metalworker. But her deadliest weapon was something no enemy could see or prepare for. The absolute certainty that came from having survived everything the wilderness could throw at 2 young women and emerged stronger rather than broken. Swift arrow. Your warriors know to wait for my signal before engaging, she asked, her voice carrying the calm authority that months of training had developed. They know, Swift Arrow confirmed. But remember, this operation succeeds only if we capture Webb alive and recover the documents he claims to know about. Killing our enemies will accomplish nothing if we cannot expose the people who sent them. The reminder was necessary because both twins had discovered during their training that they possessed capacity for violence that would have horrified their former selves. Learning to fight had awakened something primal and unforgiving in both young women, something that wanted to make their enemies pay for every moment of fear, every night of cold, every loss they had endured. But revenge was a luxury they could not afford. Justice required evidence, exposure, and consequences that reached beyond the individual men who had hunted them. As dawn broke over the valley where their family had died, the twins found themselves studying a landscape that looked both exactly the same and completely different from their memories. The scattered remains of wagon wheels and household goods were still visible, weathered by months of exposure, but not yet completely reclaimed by the earth. But what struck them most forcefully was how small the massacre site appeared now, how confined the space where their entire world had been destroyed. I remember it being bigger, Winter Wolf murmured, her trained eyes cataloguing defensive positions and tactical opportunities, where once she had seen only chaos and terror. Fear makes everything seem larger, Moonwalker replied, though her own memories of that terrible day seemed somehow compressed when compared to the reality spread before them. We were children then, hiding from something we couldn't understand. Now we're here by choice, with purpose and preparation. Luna materialized from the morning shadows, her presence immediately followed by subtle movements that indicated the entire wolf pack was in position around the valley's perimeter. The white-muzzled female approached Moonwalker directly and performed a complex series of gestures that the young woman had learned to read like written language. 8 men in the camp positioned exactly where we expected, Moonwalker translated for Swift Arrow. But Luna says there's something else, fresh tracks indicating that additional riders approached during the night and then departed before dawn. Winter Wolf felt her warrior instincts sharpened to full alertness. Reinforcements or messengers carrying new orders? Before anyone could speculate further, a voice called out from the enemy camp, Marcus Webb himself, apparently confident, enough in his position to announce his presence openly. "Sarah and Emma Patterson," he shouted, using their birth names with deliberate intent. "I know you're out there. I knew your father, worked alongside him for 3 years. I have information you need to hear." The twins exchanged glances. Their months of tactical training making them immediately suspicious of any enemy who seemed eager to negotiate. But they also recognized that Webb's willingness to reveal himself might provide opportunities that a more cautious opponent would never offer. "He's trying to draw us into conversation," Moonwalker observed quietly. "Make us reveal our positions or our numbers. Or he genuinely believes he has something we want more than his death," Winterwolf countered. "Either way, we maintain our plan. Swift Arrow, are your men ready?" The war leader nodded, his hand moving to signal warriors positioned in concealment around the valley's rim. But before anyone could move, Webb called out again, this time with information that stopped everyone in their tracks. "Your father didn't just record payments to men who attacked Indian villages," he shouted. "He documented a plan to wipe out every tribe between here and California. Names, dates, payments, government officials who approved the operations. The papers he hid contain evidence that could hang senators and territorial governors." Walker felt her analytical mind racing through the implications of this revelation. If Webb was telling the truth, the documents they sought represented more than just evidence of past crimes. They contained proof of ongoing genocide that could potentially be stopped if the right people were exposed. "He's telling the truth," she whispered to Winterwolf. "I can hear it in his voice. He's desperate, but not because he's lying. He's desperate because he knows how valuable this information really is." Winterwolf studied the enemy camp through eyes that had been trained to read tactical situations with precision. Something about the positioning and behavior of Webb's companions suggested they were not entirely comfortable with their leader's decision to reveal so much information. Several of the men kept glancing toward the valley's eastern rim, as if expecting something to appear there. "Luna," she called softly, knowing the wolf could hear her even across the considerable distance. "Check the eastern approach. Something's wrong." What happened next unfolded with the terrifying efficiency of a plan that had been months in the making. Luna's howl from the eastern rim carried a warning that made every Cheyenne warrior tense with readiness. A large force of armed riders was approaching rapidly, intending to trap anyone in the valley between themselves and Webb's positioned. Men. It was bait, Moonwalker realized with cold clarity. All of it. Webb's information, his willingness to negotiate, even his desperation. It was all designed to keep us in position long enough for their reinforcements to arrive. But the enemy's plan contained a fatal flaw that revealed their fundamental misunderstanding of what the Patterson twins had become. They had prepared for a trap involving desperate survivors, not a coordinated military operation guided by intelligence networks that extended far beyond human capabilities. Swift Arrow's signal brought 12 Cheyenne warriors into action with the fluid precision of people who had trained together for years. But more importantly, it activated Luna's pack in a coordinated assault that their enemies had no preparation for or defense against. 20 wolves materiating from concealment simultaneously created chaos that no amount of military training could have prepared Webb's men to handle. Horses screamed and reared in terror, throwing riders who found themselves facing predators that seemed to attack with human intelligence and coordination. But the wolves were not killing randomly. Under Luna's leadership, they focused on disrupting the enemy's formations, separating riders from their mounts, and creating opportunities for the Cheyenne warriors to close with opponents who had lost every tactical advantage they thought they possessed. Winter. Wolf moved through the battle with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to see violence as dance, her lance finding targets with precision that eliminated threats without unnecessary brutality. This was not revenge. It was surgery, removing dangers with the minimum force necessary to achieve their objectives. Moonwalker had positioned herself to observe and document the entire engagement, but she was not passive in her role. Her bow provided covering fire for Cheyenne warriors, and her systematic approach to target selection ensured that key enemies were neutralized before they could organize effective resistance. The battle lasted less than 20 minutes, but when the dust settled, Webb and 3 of his companions were alive and captured, while the approaching reinforcements had been scattered by wolf attacks that left them more concerned with survival than completing their mission. "Marcus Webb, Winter," Wolf said, approaching the captured man with the calm authority of someone who had earned the right to demand answers. "You're going to tell us everything you know about our father's documents, and then you're going to help us use that information to ensure that no other families suffer what ours suffered." Webb looked up at her with eyes that showed both fear and recognition. The terrified girls he had expected to capture were nowhere to be seen. Instead, he faced young women who had been transformed by loss and hardship into something he had no framework for understanding. Survivors who had become avengers, victims who had learned to fight back with skills and allies that bridged 2 worlds. "The trunk," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your father sewed the papers into the lining of your mother's trunk, the one with her initials carved into the lid. If it survived the massacre, if it's still here—" Moonwalker was already moving toward the scattered remains of their family's belongings, her memory guiding her to the spot where she had last seen the trunk that contained her mother's most precious possessions. If their father had indeed hidden crucial evidence there, it would represent not just vindication of their months of preparation, but the weapon they needed to ensure that justice extended far beyond this valley. The massacre site that had once represented the end of everything they knew was about to become the place where they reclaimed not just their past, but their power to shape the future for everyone who had suffered from the greed and violence that had destroyed so much. The trunk lay partially buried under debris and weathered by 18 months of exposure to Wyoming's harsh climate, but the carved initials MP, Margaret Patterson, were still visible on its water-stained lid. Moonwalker knelt beside it with hands that trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of what this moment represented. Everything they had endured, everything they had become, had led to this discovery that might finally provide justice for their family and countless others. Winter Wolf stood guard while her sister carefully examined the trunk's construction, looking for the hidden compartment their father had supposedly created. The battle was over, their enemies defeated or scattered, but the most crucial part of their mission was just beginning. Webb watched from where he sat under guard, his eyes reflecting the desperate hope of a man whose survival now depended on the accuracy of his information. "Here," Moonwalker whispered, her fingers finding an irregularity in the trunk's lining. "The stitching is different along this edge. Newer thread, different pattern. Pa was never much of a seamstress, but he tried to make it look like Ma's work." With careful precision, she opened the hidden seam to reveal an oiled leather packet that had been protected from moisture and decay. Inside were documents that would have seemed mundane to casual observers: railroad correspondence, payment vouchers, shipping manifests. But Moonwalker's analytical mind immediately recognized their significance. "These aren't just records of payments to raiders," she said, her voice carrying wonder and horror in equal measure. "These are orders, official government correspondence authorizing the removal of native populations from specific territories. Names, dates, amounts paid, expected results." Winter Wolf moved closer to examine the papers, her warrior's instincts now focused on understanding the enemy they truly faced. The first document she examined bore the official seal of the Colorado territorial government, dated just 3 months before their family had departed for Oregon. It authorized payment of $2,000 to freelance military contractors for clearing hostile elements from railroad survey routes between Denver and Fort Collins. Who signed these orders? How high does this conspiracy reach? Winter Wolf asked, though she suspected she already knew. The answer would be more disturbing than they had imagined. Moonwalker's finger traced down a list of signatures that included territorial governors, army officers, railroad executives, and federal appointees, high enough to destroy anyone who threatens to expose it. Pa wasn't just recording crimes. He was documenting treason and genocide planned at the highest levels of government. The documents revealed a systematic campaign that stretched across multiple territories and involved coordination between civilian authorities, military commands, and private corporations. Railroad companies had provided funding, territorial governments had provided legal authority, and military units had provided tactical support for operations designed to eliminate native populations from lands designated for development. But the most shocking revelation was the scope of what had been planned. The documents outlined a comprehensive strategy for the final resolution of the Indian problem that would have resulted in the complete elimination or forced relocation of every native tribe between the Mississippi River and the Pacific coast. Swift Arrow examined the documents with the grim satisfaction of someone whose people had suffered from the policies they revealed. These papers prove what we have always known but could never demonstrate, that the attacks on our villages, the broken treaties, the forced relocations, all of it was coordinated policy, not random violence. There's more, Moonwalker said, continuing to examine the contents of the leather packet. Look at this correspondence between territorial governors. They're discussing timetables, coordination of military units, even plans for disposing of evidence after operations are completed. One particular letter, written by Colorado Territorial Governor Samuel Crawford to his counterpart in Wyoming, outlined specific instructions for ensuring that no witnesses survived to testify about government involvement in attacks on native villages. The language was bureaucratic, but the intent was unmistakably genocidal. Your father must have realized what he had discovered, Webb said quietly, his voice carrying the tone of a man making final confessions. These documents don't just prove that crimes were committed. They prove that those crimes were part of a systematic plan to exterminate entire peoples. The implications of their discovery extended far beyond personal vindication. In their hands, they held evidence that could topple government officials, end military careers, bankrupt railroad companies, and potentially prevent the planned extermination of dozens of native tribes across the Western Territories. But transforming documents into justice would require more than simply possessing evidence. It would require getting that evidence to people with the power and courage to act upon it, while surviving the inevitable response from enemies who would stop at nothing to prevent their exposure. There's something else you need to know, Webb continued, his confession taking on urgency as he realized the full implications of what they had discovered. Your father didn't just hide copies here. He sent duplicates to a newspaper editor in Denver, a federal judge in Kansas, and a minister in Chicago who's been documenting government crimes against Indian peoples. Moonwalker looked up sharply, her analytical mind immediately grasping the significance of this revelation. You're saying there are other copies of these documents already in the hands of people who might use them? I'm saying your father was smarter than any of us realized, Webb replied. He knew that hiding evidence in one place would never be enough. He created a network of people who could act independently if anything happened to him or his family. The massacre of your wagon train was supposed to prevent this information from ever being used, but your father had already put safeguards in place. Webb went on to explain that William Patterson had spent months before his family's departure, carefully copying the most damaging documents and establishing contact with people in positions to act on the evidence. The newspaper editor in Denver, Thomas Morrison, had been publishing a series of investigative articles about railroad company activities. The federal judge in Kansas, Honor Jonas Whitman, had been looking for evidence to support federal intervention in territorial affairs. The minister in Chicago, Reverend Michael Hayes, had been organizing religious opposition to government policies toward Native Americans. Each of them received packets of documents with instructions to act if anything happened to your family. Webb explained, "Your father's death was supposed to end this investigation, but instead it triggered a coordinated response that has grown beyond anyone's ability to control through violence alone." The revelation transformed their situation completely. Instead of being the sole possessors of dangerous secrets, they were part of a larger strategy that their father had put in place months before his death. The massacre of their wagon train had been intended to silence whistleblowers, but it had instead activated a network of allies they hadn't known existed. "Then our job isn't to expose this conspiracy ourselves," Winterwolf realized. "Our job is to survive long enough for the network Pa created to do its work and to provide living testimony that validates the documentary evidence." Over the following days, as they prepared to leave the massacre site and return to the hidden Cheyenne village, the twins began to understand the full scope of what their father had accomplished and what their survival had made possible. Messages arrived through the complex communication network that Running Fox had established. Coded communications from Denver, Kansas, and Chicago that confirmed Webb's claims about duplicate documents and revealed that investigations were already underway at multiple levels of government. The newspaper editor in Denver had published a series of articles exposing railroad company involvement in attacks on native villages, using photocopies of the original documents to provide irrefutable proof of corporate involvement in genocide. The series had been picked up by newspapers in San Francisco, St. Louis, and New York, creating national attention that made it impossible for territorial authorities to suppress the story. The federal judge in Kansas had initiated legal proceedings against several territorial officials, issuing warrants for their arrest on charges of conspiracy, murder, and violations of federal treaties with native tribes. His jurisdiction extended across multiple territories, giving him authority to pursue suspects who might flee to avoid prosecution in their home regions. The minister in Chicago had organized a coalition of churches demanding congressional investigations into government policy toward Indian tribes. Religious leaders across the Midwest had begun preaching sermons about government-sponsored violence, creating moral pressure that complemented the legal and journalistic efforts already underway. "Your father's death was supposed to end this," Running Fox explained as he translated the latest coded messages. "Instead, it began a process that has grown too large for our enemies to stop through violence alone. They can kill individuals, but they cannot kill an idea whose time has come." But their enemies had not given up. Reports from Wolf Scouts and human observers indicated that large numbers of armed men were converging on the region, suggesting that someone with significant resources was preparing for a final decisive attempt to eliminate everyone connected to the documentary evidence. The scope of the response was unprecedented. Military units that should have been patrolling other territories were being redirected toward Wyoming. Private security forces employed by railroad companies were mobilizing, with equipment and authority that exceeded anything they had demonstrated before. Even civilian law enforcement agencies seemed to be coordinating their activities in ways that suggested federal involvement. "They're not just trying to silence us anymore," Moonwalker observed as she analyzed the intelligence reports. "They're trying to eliminate everyone who might possibly have access to copies of the documents or knowledge of their contents." Grandmother Willow received these reports with the calm that came from having lived through many crises, but her response surprised everyone who heard it. "It is time for Winter Wolf and Moonwalker to leave the mountains," she announced during the evening council. "Their transformation from victims to warriors is complete, but their greater work lies in the world beyond our hidden valley." The statement hit both twins like physical blows. The Cheyenne village had become home in ways that their original families had never achieved. These people had accepted them, trained them, given them new names and new identities that felt more authentic than anything they had known in their former lives. "We don't want to leave," Winter Wolf said, her voice carrying pain that months of warrior training had not eliminated. "This is our home now. These are our people, and you will always be our daughters," Grandmother Willow replied gently. "But the spirits that guided you to us have larger purposes for your lives. The evidence you have recovered, the skills you have learned, the allies you have gained, all of this was preparation for work that cannot be accomplished from hiding." Moonwalker understood before her sister did. "You're saying we need to return to the white world, use what we've learned here to fight the same battles there." "I'm saying that justice requires witnesses who can speak in courtrooms and newspaper offices and church pulpits," Grandmother Willow explained. "Two young women who survived Massacre learned to live with wolves and returned to reclaim evidence that exposes government crimes. That is a story the white world will have to hear, and a testimony they will not be able to dismiss or ignore." The conversation that followed revealed the full wisdom of Grandmother Willow's strategy. The documentary evidence alone, no matter how compelling, could be dismissed as forgeries or explained away through legal technicalities. But living witnesses who could testify about their personal experiences, who bore physical and emotional scars that validated their testimony, would be far more difficult for their enemies to discredit. Moreover, the twins' unique experiences, their survival through alliance with wolves, their integration into Cheyenne society, their transformation from helpless victims into capable warriors, provided them with moral authority that would be impossible for government officials to challenge without seeming callous and cruel. The farewell ceremonies took place over several days, with rituals that formally recognized the twins' permanent membership in the Cheyenne people, while also blessing their departure for the dangerous work that lay ahead. They would leave as cultural ambassadors, carrying not just evidence of government crimes, but living proof that cooperation between different peoples was possible and beneficial. Luna and her pack would accompany them, not as wild animals returning to civilization, but as partners in a mission that transcended the boundaries between human and animal, between different cultures, between the world that was dying and the world that might be born if enough people chose courage over comfort. The ceremony that established this unprecedented arrangement involved not just the human members of the community, but the wolves themselves, who seemed to understand the significance of what was being planned. Luna approached each twin individually, pressing her muzzle against their hands in a gesture that seemed to formalize their continuing partnership. The wolves choose to go with you because they understand that some battles must be fought in places where only humans can go, Grandmother Willow explained. But they will remain wolves, and you will remain connected to the wild wisdom that has guided your survival. This partnership will serve as proof that different ways of life can strengthen each other rather than being in conflict. The journey from the hidden valley took them first to Denver, where the newspaper editor who had been publishing their father's evidence provided them with legal protection and public platform. Thomas Morrison proved to be a man in his 50s whose commitment to journalistic integrity had made him enemies among powerful interests, but also allies among people who valued truth over comfort. Their story, told in Moonwalker's careful words and supported by Winter Wolf's quiet dignity, created sensations that reached far beyond Colorado territory. Two young women who had survived Massacre learned to live with wolves, and returned to expose the conspiracy that had destroyed their family, became symbols of resilience that inspired others to demand justice for all victims of government-sponsored violence. The initial newspaper interviews led to invitations to speak at churches, schools, and civic organizations throughout the region. Each appearance generated additional publicity and public support, while also providing opportunities to present the documentary evidence in contexts where its significance could be fully explained and understood. But the most important development was the response from other survivors of government-sponsored violence. Native Americans who had lost family members in attacks they had been told were random raids began coming forward with their own testimonies. White settlers who had witnessed military units participating in attacks on native villages found the courage to speak publicly about what they had seen. The trials that followed sent 3 territorial governors to prison, ended the careers of dozens of military officers, bankrupted 2 railroad companies, and led to congressional investigations that fundamentally changed federal policy toward Native American peoples. But the legal victories were only part of what the twins had accomplished. Perhaps more importantly, Winter Wolf and Moonwalker had proven that victims could become victors, that survivors could become leaders, and that justice was possible even when it seemed that all hope was lost. Their example inspired other people who had suffered injustice to find their own voices and demand their own recognition. The school they established 5 years later in the foothills of Colorado, the Patterson Institute for Cross-Cultural Understanding, became the first educational institution in the American West designed specifically to serve both Native American and white children in the same classrooms. Using teaching methods that honored different ways of understanding the world, visitors to the school were often startled by the wolves that roamed the grounds freely, participating in classes and protecting students with the same dedication they had once shown to 2 lost girls in a Wyoming cave. Luna, now elderly but still commanding respect from both humans and animals, had become something of a legend herself, a symbol of the wisdom that could be gained by those willing to form alliances across the boundaries that others considered absolute. "They're not just animals," Moonwalker would explain to curious observers, her hair now showing silver streaks that spoke of years spent in demanding work, but her eyes still holding the analytical intensity that had helped her survive. In the wilderness, they're teachers, partners, and reminders that survival sometimes requires alliances that seem impossible until they become necessary. Winter Wolf, now the school's director of practical education, had developed curricula that combined traditional academic subjects with wilderness survival skills, conflict resolution techniques learned from Cheyenne culture, and leadership development programs that prepared students to bridge different worlds rather than choosing sides between them. The silver lockets still hung around their necks, no longer symbols of loss and theft, but representations of transformation and justice achieved through courage, determination, and the willingness to see potential allies in the most unlikely places. The pressed flowers their mother had placed inside had long since crumbled to dust, but they had been replaced with small amounts of sage from the hidden Cheyenne Valley, a reminder of the home that had made their return to the world possible. 20 years after the massacre that was meant to destroy their family and silence their father's evidence, Sarah and Emma Patterson, Winter Wolf and Moonwalker, had created something unprecedented in American education and social policy. Their school graduated students who went on to serve as bridges between different communities. Their legal testimony had permanently changed how the federal government dealt with Native American tribes, and their personal example had inspired countless others to refuse to accept that victims must remain powerless. The story that began with abandonment and terror had become a legacy of hope that would inspire generations of people who refuse to accept that different peoples cannot learn to live together, or that justice is impossible in a world that often seems designed to reward cruelty and punish compassion. In the end, two girls who survived by hiding in a wolf den had grown into women who changed the world by refusing to stay hidden, proving that sometimes the most devastating endings are actually the most extraordinary beginnings, if we're brave enough to transform our wounds into weapons for justice. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.